Welcome and thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Christopher Lowry. I'll be talking about MudMap, connecting dirt, old friends, and stress resilience. First, some disclosures. I'm a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of Imagilon Therapeutics. I'm associated with Mycobacteria Therapeutics Corporation, which is engaged in isolating novel strains of mycobacteria from soils, and I'm a member of the faculty of the Integrative Psychiatry Institute here in Boulder, Colorado. So, an outline of today's talk, I'd like to talk about a crisis of mental health, the idea of prevention of mental health disorders, introduce the hygiene hypothesis, and its potential relevance to psychiatric disorders, then talk about psychiatric disorders as disorders with the failure of immunoregulation, the idea that restoration of immunoregulation using mycobacterium species can prevent development of a stress-induced PTSD-like syndrome, and then end with some conclusions. So first, the crisis of mental health. This is an announcement from the U.S. Surgeon General that was issued on December 7th, 2021, along with a report. And in this report, the U.S. Surgeon General highlights what he considers to be a mental health crisis, particularly among young people, which was worsened by the pandemic. And we now know that this increase in mental health conditions is worldwide. So this highlights a need for prevention of mental health disorders. And this idea was first put forward by Tom Insel and his colleagues in 2006. Tom Insel at the time was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health at NIH. And in this paper, they said that in contrast to researchers in cancer and heart disease who've sought cures and preventions, biological psychiatrists in both academia and industry have set their sights on incremental and marketable advances, such as drugs with fewer adverse effects. They went on to say that psychiatry will need to develop strategies for prevention each of these disorders. And in this context, they were talking about schizophrenia, mood disorders like depression, and autism. So where should we start in search of prevention strategies for psychiatric disorders or optimizing stress resilience? We argue that we should consider the risk factors for psychiatric disorders. These include genetic predisposition, environmental influences, which can include adverse childhood experiences, social determinants of health, and we argue microbial inputs. So these include, as we all know, pro-inflammatory microbial inputs, which are common among many pathogens, but also immunoregulatory microbial inputs, which have the capacity to suppress inappropriate inflammation. An imbalance in these types of inputs can lead to a failure of immunoregulation and can lead to chronic low-grade inflammation that we know is a risk factor for psychiatric disorders. So this is just highlighting that during the period from 1950 to 2000, particularly in developed countries, Western countries, including Scandinavia and Belgium, there's an increase in autoimmune diseases and asthma. And this includes conditions like multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, one of the inflammatory bowel diseases, and type 1 diabetes. This was occurring during a period of increased urbanization in the United States and other Western countries. And you can see from this update in 2018 by the same author that this increase in inflammatory conditions like multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes is not worldwide and in fact is predominantly limited to Western societies. So there have been many hypotheses proposed to account for this increase in inflammatory disease in Western urban societies, one of which is the hygiene hypothesis. And in 2008, my colleague Graham Rook and I wrote a paper in Transit Immunology linking the hygiene hypothesis in psychiatric disorders, and we argued that some psychiatric disorders in developed countries might be attributable to failure of immunoregulatory circuits to terminate ongoing inflammatory responses. In contrast, there are some microorganisms, predominantly in environmental sources, that Graham and his colleagues named the old friends. And these old friends can bind to receptors on immature dendritic cells, induce the differentiation of regulatory dendritic cells to produce regulatory dendritic cells, which can bias the differentiation of naive T cells into regulatory T cells that produce anti-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 10 and TGF-beta, which in turn can prevent inappropriate inflammation in response to self-antigens, gut contents, and other allergens. An update on the hygiene hypothesis was published this year in a book co-edited by Graham Rook and myself. So what about psychiatric disorders as disorders with the failure of immunoregulation? I only want to show one slide in this context, which is this slide from O'Donovan and colleagues in 2015, showing an increased risk of autoimmune conditions, individuals with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So that's shown in red. And you can see increases in any autoimmune disorder, but also specific autoimmune conditions, including thyroiditis, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and lupus, particularly in comparison to persons with no psychiatric disorder. Moving on to restoration of immunoregulation using mycobacteria, which can prevent development of stress-induced PTSD-like syndrome in animal models. So again, Mycobacterium vaccae, the strain NCTC 11659, was isolated by John Stanford and his colleagues in 1970s, and it was isolated from the shores of the Kyoga Nile near Lake Kyoga in Uganda. Since that time, a number of research laboratories across the globe have shown that immunization with this strain of bacterium can prevent development of a PTSD-like syndrome in animal models and can impact phenotypes that are relevant to a number of symptom clusters in persons with PTSD, including avoidance, negative alterations in mood and cognition, and alterations in arousal and reactivity. And these citations are included here at the bottom. Having said that, there's a lot that we don't know about the relationship between the soil microbiome, the food that we eat, and our own microbiomes. In this article by Michael Bahar, published in 2020, he pointed out that the next step for scientists is to figure out how soil microbes interact with our microbiome to protect us from illness. And I would highlight that it's not only the gut microbiome that we need to think about, but it's also the upper respiratory microbiome. And in fact, it's the upper respiratory area contains a hidden mycobacterium, presumably through inhalation of mycobacteria associated with dust from soil in our environment. And this group identified a total of 50 prevalent mycobacteria species using Illumina sequencing from the oral activity in upper respiratory tract, including the nostrils and oropharynx. So I think the study required some suspension of disbelief on the part of the co-authors. This is a group in South Korea that published this paper in 2022. And what they did is they had people sit at a table and simply mix soil. So you can imagine that the dust from the soil is getting into the air. They may be breathing some of this dust. And they asked the participants to do this for 5 minutes. And there were two types of soil that was sterilized and soil that was sterilized but contained Mycobacterium vaccae. And then they measured a number of physiological responses and took blood samples to assess the metabolome. And what they found was striking in that there were, even in this rapid time frame, there were changes in organic acids circulating in blood, including serotonin, decreases in levels of fatty acids, including the inflammatory lipid palmitic acid, increases in activity, alpha wave activity in the occipital cortex, and decreased heart rate. So just to reiterate, a plea to save our soils. This was the recognition in 2011 by Van Wart that we have a potential crisis that involves degradation of our soils across the globe. So I'd like to conclude just summarizing that soil microbes and microbiome-based interventions to increase anti-inflammatory and immunoregulatory signaling might be considered for prevention and treatment of psychiatric disorders. Thank you so much.